In the early 1930s, 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. Banks were taking homes from families who had spent their whole lives paying for them. That's when 2 poor young people from Texas started robbing those same banks and running from the police. The strange thing is, half the country was rooting for them. To understand why, you need to know the world Bonnie and Clyde grew up in. Number 1. Everybody knows the numbers from the Great Depression. What almost nobody talks about is what they meant for an ordinary family. Between 1932 and 1934, farmers in the southern United States were going hungry on their own land. The price of cotton crashed. Anyone selling their crop for 18 cents a pound in 1929 could barely get 6 cents in 1932. The debts they took on during the good years turned into a noose around their neck. And the banks, which had handed out money without blinking in the 1920s, were now taking homes and land with the coldness of someone who only looks at a spreadsheet. This was the world Bonnie and Clyde grew up in, not as villains born for crime, but as children of a land that had fallen apart. And that's where the story starts to make sense. Number 2. Banks were the real everyday villains. In the 1930s, for the average worker, a bank wasn't just a building full of money. It was the guy knocking on your door to kick your family out of your home. Imagine waking up in the morning and coming face to face with a bank employee and a court officer, telling you that you only have a few hours to pack your things before they change the locks. In the South and the Midwest, this became routine. The farm your grandfather spent his whole life building could disappear in a single day. And the numbers speak for themselves. It's estimated that more than 1 million families lost homes and land between 1930 and 1934 in the southern states alone. So when Bonnie and Clyde robbed a bank, a lot of people around there didn't see it as a crime. They saw it as payback against the ones who had taken everything from them. Number 3. Bonnie and Clyde were from the neighborhood, and that's meant literally. The Barrow Gang moved through Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Missouri. These were exactly the states that got hit hardest by the Great Depression, with drought wiping out the crops for good and forcing families onto the road. When they robbed places, it was in small towns, close to home, places they knew by name and by face. And here's the point almost nobody talks about. People in those parts didn't see just any 2 criminals passing through the dust. They saw 2 poor young people, raised in the same misery, going head to head with the banks and the government that had stripped them of everything. It wasn't support for crime. It was people seeing themselves in them. That's why the cheering didn't come from fear. It came from seeing, in those 2, their own anger that nobody there could let out. Number 4. Farmers hid the gang by choice. It wasn't fear, it was a choice. Between 1932 and 1934, police records from several states show that farming families opened their doors to Bonnie and Clyde dozens of times. They gave them food, a bed, and a place to spend the night. Some ended up getting arrested for it, and still, they didn't regret it. When the police asked why, the answer was almost always the same. That couple wasn't any worse than the bank man who took the family farm. Stop for a moment and think about what that means. The same bank that was throwing the neighbor next door out was seen as the real thief. Clyde even left money with at least 3 families in exchange for shelter. Money taken from banks in the area, going straight back into the hands of people who had lost everything in the crisis. Number 5. Newspapers turned the couple into a sales thermometer. Every time Bonnie and Clyde showed up on the front page, circulation went up. The Dallas Morning News reportedly sold 40% more on the days it put the duo on the cover. Editors noticed the pattern and started saving their best headlines for those moments. And who was buying? Working people, often women, saving their spare change to follow every escape. In 1933, an Oklahoma newspaper ran a street poll. 67% of those interviewed were rooting for the couple to shake off the police. Think about what that means. In the middle of the Depression, with banks taking farms and unemployment knocking at the door, most people would rather see two outlaws beat the system. It wasn't about crime. It was about who people blamed for their own misery. Number 6. J. Edgar Hoover saw how big the problem was and fought back with propaganda. There was one thing the government just couldn't stomach. People liked that duo. In the middle of the Depression, with banks taking honest people's homes, many saw Bonnie and Clyde as the ones giving payback. J. Edgar Hoover, head of the agency that would later become the FBI, understood the danger. It wasn't enough to arrest two outlaws. He had to change how people felt. The move was through the newspapers. Hoover started giving reporters the other side, the dead officers, the families left without a father, the blood nobody was showing. Little by little, the fugitives stopped being beloved rebels and became public enemies, hunted without mercy. That's how a big part of the machine that still exists today was born. And the detail few people notice is simple. Hoover didn't win with bullets first. He won with the story he chose to tell. Number 7. The victims the press didn't remember. The Barrow Gang left around 13 people dead along the way. And who were they? Mostly officers from small towns and rural counties, men on low wages, barely making ends meet, people from the same working class as Bonnie and Clyde. Some left wives and young children at home. They went out for their shift in the morning and didn't come back for dinner. But one thing stands out. The newspapers gave page after page to the escapes, the chases, the shootouts, and the grief of those families, almost nothing. A few loose lines at the end of the story. That imbalance wasn't an accident. It was what the public wanted to read. In people's minds, it looked like the little guy against the giant, and the average American rooted for the underdog, even when that underdog was taking the lives of innocent people. Number 8. The paradox. Nobody talks about when it comes to Bonnie and Clyde. The whole country rooted for the duo, believing they were going after the big city banks, the ones taking farms and throwing families out on the street. But the truth was different. Clyde Barrow's gang mainly targeted small-town banks, many of them already broke and run by people just as hard up as the victims themselves. There was no Robin Hood in this story. Nobody was sharing the money with the poor. They were stealing from people who barely had anything left to lose, just to stay on the run. But deep in the Depression, people needed someone to call a hero, and the newspapers picked up on that right away. The more they fed the legend, the more papers flew off the newsstands. That's how the lie stuck and never let go. In the end, they robbed the poor just to survive. The legend swore the exact opposite. Number 9. The government became everyone's villain. To understand why so many people rooted for two bank robbers, you first need to understand the hate people felt toward Washington. Between 1932 and 1934, the average American looked at the Capitol and saw only one thing: people protecting banks and turning their backs on the public. And there was more than enough reason for it. Not long before, thousands of World War I veterans camped out in Washington, demanding the pension the government had promised them. Herbert Hoover's response was to send in the army itself to force out the men who had fought for the country. After a scene like that, anyone who stood up to the government, even a criminal, ended up winning the public's sympathy. That's where Bonnie and Clyde come in. They weren't revolutionaries, and they never stood for any political idea. But they were in the right place at the right time to become the mirror of an entire country's anger. Number 10. The end of the Depression. Took the sympathy with it. Think about it. Why did so many honest people root for two bank robbers? The answer was in their pockets. When the crash of '29 brought the country down, banks became the villains. They took homes, farms, everything a family had. So when Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker cleaned out a bank vault, a lot of people saw payback, not crime. Starting in 1934, the tide turned. The economy started breathing again, and Roosevelt's New Deal put people back to work with food on the table. And when people got their hope back, they stopped needing criminals to call heroes. Bonnie and Clyde died in an ambush in May of that year in Louisiana. 2 years earlier, that would have outraged half of America. But that day, most people just shook their heads and moved on. The hero had become just another outlaw. Number 11. Stop and think. You've seen dozens of movies about Bonnie and Clyde, but has anyone ever explained where they came from? Almost every production shows the two of them as if they had fallen out of the sky. Two young rebels with no past and no world around them. And that's no accident. Telling the personal story makes for a good script. Talking about hunger, eviction, and banks taking families' land doesn't fill movie theaters. Remember, it was the Great Depression. People were losing homes, farms, and jobs, while the bank on the corner was tightening the noose around everyone's neck. That's why so many regular people rooted for the duo. They were robbing the very people crushing the little guy. But there's an uncomfortable side to it. Admitting that misery created the couple forces you to ask what was wrong with the system itself. And it's always easier to point to the charismatic criminal than to face what created him. Number 12. The economic legacy, the reforms, the depression, forced. The same misery that made people root for Bonnie and Clyde ended up changing the American banking system forever. When banks failed, regular people lost a lifetime's worth of savings. There was no safety net. You put your money in the bank, and from one day to the next, it was gone. That's when the turning point came. In 1933, the Glass-Steagall Act separated regular banks from investment banks so no one could gamble your money in the stock market without you knowing. That same year, the FDIC was born and started guaranteeing people's deposits, and rules came in to protect farmers who were losing their land. The irony is huge. The same hunger that turned two thieves into heroes forced the reforms that would make that kind of revolt much harder to happen again. Number 13. The Dust Bowl, when the sky itself became the enemy. As if the economic crash wasn't enough, the sky also became the enemy. Between 1930 and 1936, the heart of America was swallowed by the Dust Bowl, dust storms that swept through Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. Exactly the territory where Bonnie and Clyde traveled. Imagine waking up and seeing a wall of dirt, dozens of feet high, coming toward you, turning the day dark in the middle of noon. That dust buried homes, killed livestock, and destroyed in a few hours everything a family had spent years building. The farmhand who had lost his job in the city was now losing his own land too. It was the sum of two disasters at the same time, empty pockets and dying ground, that pushed entire families onto the road and to the edge. And when everything falls apart, who do you start to see as a hero? It was in that desperation that two outlaws started to look like people just like us. Number 14. The prison system that created Clyde Barrow. Clyde Barrow didn't go into prison as a killer. He went in as a skinny 21-year-old, caught for car theft. People who knew him before swore he was just a regular kid. Prison changed everything. In 1930, he was sent to Eastham Prison Farm in Texas, considered one of the worst in the country. There, inmates were beaten every day by guards and by each other, and the fieldwork could break any man. Even worse, Clyde became the target of an older inmate, and the abuse went on for months without anyone lifting a finger. One day, he fought back and killed the man with a lead pipe. Another inmate took the blame for him. It was the first time Clyde had taken a life. When he got out in 1932, he was a different man. A cellmate summed it up in a way nobody forgets. "I watched a boy turn into a rattlesnake right before my eyes." From then on, Clyde had only one goal in his mind: make the system pay for what it had done to him. Number 15, Bonnie Parker's childhood, the other side of poverty. Almost everyone knows Bonnie through Clyde's side of the story, but her story starts long before that, and it says just as much as his. Bonnie Parker was born in Texas in 1910. Her father was a bricklayer and died when she was 4. Her mother took the kids and went to live in a poor suburb of Dallas, and that's where Bonnie grew up. At school, she stood out. She won writing contests, loved poetry, and had a sharp mind. But poverty doesn't care who's smart. At 16, she married Roy Thornton. Not long after, he was arrested for robbery and murder. Bonnie never filed for divorce. She was wearing her wedding ring the day she died. At 20, tied to a husband behind bars, with no money and no future in sight, she met Clyde in 1930. The Great Depression didn't create the pressure she was already living under. It just kept locking, one by one, the few doors she still had left. Number 16. The day the government attacked its own veterans. In the summer of 1932, thousands of men who had fought for America in World War I set up camp right in the middle of Washington. There were about 17,000 veterans, many with their wives and children with them, asking only for the payment of a pension the government had promised years earlier. Instead of an answer, they got the Army. President Hoover ordered General Douglas MacArthur to clear the camp. And what came next was cavalry, tanks, and tear gas turned on people who had shed blood for the country. The news spread from coast to coast and left everyone outraged. It was around that same time that Clyde Barrow started robbing for real. And then the math became simple in people's minds. The government was beating people who had served, while Clyde was hitting banks. For a lot of tired, broke people, only one of those two sides still seemed to have any reason left. Number 17. Pretty Boy Floyd and John Dillinger. The Depression Gang. Bonnie and Clyde had company. While the country was starving, several criminals became people's heroes. Pretty Boy Floyd was treated like a hero in Oklahoma. People said he tore up mortgages during robberies to save small farmers' land. None of that was ever proven, but everyone believed it. John Dillinger made headlines by escaping one jail after another, always with that calm way of acting like he wasn't afraid of anyone. Even old Ma Barker became part of this story, leading a gang made up of her own sons. What few people understood at the time was that this wasn't an isolated case. It was a whole country rooting against the banks and against the government. Hoover saw that. That's when he created the idea of the public enemy. Not just to catch some random thief, but to change people's minds and turn these men from heroes into threats. Number 18. Radio Spread, the legend. In the 1930s, radio was what connected the average American most closely to the outside world. It stayed on in the kitchen, in the living room, in the workshop, all day long. And it was through radio that Bonnie and Clyde's names entered the lives of millions of people broken by the Depression. News traveled from coast to coast in just a few hours, something printed newspapers could never pull off. Think about it. While banks were taking farms and families were sleeping on the road, Radio was telling the story of a couple robbing those very banks. For people with no job and no hope, that almost sounded like justice. And the two of them knew what they were doing. On at least 2 occasions, they sent letters to the right journalists, knowing they would be read live on the air. Long before there were people paid to manage someone's image, they were already controlling their own fame. Number 19. Why America rooted for Bonnie and Clyde. The Great Depression. Nobody explains. In the early 30s, banks were nobody's friend. They took the farm, kicked the family out, and moved on without blinking. That was the mood when Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker showed up. When the two of them robbed a bank, a lot of regular people didn't see a crime. They saw a score being settled. The money the bank had taken from people was coming back, even if it was through the hands of 2 outlaws. But it wasn't just about 2 young people with guns and a stolen car. It was about what they represented to people who had lost everything and had no one to turn to. The law protected the very people throwing families out, so rooting against the law felt like the right side. Every one of their escapes became a small win for people who had nothing left to lose. The truth is simple. America didn't love crime. It loved seeing someone, anyone, hit back at the people who had always called the shots. Number 20. The collapse of trust in American institutions. Imagine watching the bank where you kept every penny shut its doors overnight. Between 1929 and 1933, that happened more than 9,000 times in the United States. Banks that swore they would protect families' savings failed, and working people's money simply vanished. The government seemed frozen, with no answer to the crisis, and the police, underpaid and just as desperate as everyone else, became the visible face of a system stacked against the average person. That's why so many people started rooting for Bonnie and Clyde. It wasn't naivety. It was the logical conclusion of people who had watched promise after promise get broken. When institutions fail you, the outlaw starts to look like the only one telling the truth. And that distrust never went away. It just changed faces. Number 21. What happened to the people who protected the couple? After Bonnie and Clyde's death, the government went after the people who had given shelter to the gang. Dozens of families who hid them, fed them, or passed along information ended up arrested, fined, or exposed in front of the whole town. The message was simple. Helping criminals comes at a high price, but police files show something few people expect. Even after being arrested, many kept saying the same thing. We did the right thing. Loyalty among poor people was stronger than any law. And here's the point nobody wants to face. Without the Depression, without the homes being taken, without banks becoming the villains of the story, without the drought that buried the crops, without a government that turned its back on veterans, Bonnie and Clyde would have been just 2 more forgotten thieves. The question was never whether they were heroes. They weren't. The question is, what it says about a country that needed to turn them into that.